I've seen his movie.
Okay, yes, brilliant.
Welcome you. This is absolutely terrific. When I came up with the idea, I first talked to Alan, and he said, let's do it. But I worried whether anybody in this highly academic institution would really want to discuss a movie which is part of popular culture. And I'm just delighted to see you because I take popular culture very seriously. I have two people you already know. First, Alan, because we cooked this up together, and Alan, who's a wonderfully imaginative person, said, yes, let's do it. That was right off the bat. Later, I was talking to Haider, and he said, yeah, I'd like to do this too, because he had seen the movie. And then I will tell you, Haider, when you see the movie again. So, in fact, he wins any kind of prizes, because anyone who's seen Django Unchained, which is a very long movie, twice deserves a great deal of credit. So, I hope there is enough food, and all of you know that if there is not enough food, it's not my fault. Okay, I think is it okay? Should I begin and then just go on? Because you said you went off. We'll just go in order. Okay. All right. This has been a wonderful year for race and slavery movies. We have two movies nominated for the Academy Award. One is Lincoln, which is done by Steven Spielberg, which is his second important movie on slavery. The first being Amistad. Is anyone? Oh yeah, Amistad. You know, this is all that, and this is very much in the tradition. Very thoughtful, very intellectual, beautifully acted. And then we turn to Quentin Tarantino, who does something, I guess you could say, and now something completely different. So I went to see the movie with great interest because I had been reading about Spike Lee and his refusal to even go see the movie, which I think is improper. And so I went to see it, and I'm going to open with a song. As some of you know, I sing. And it's a song that haunts my imagination, which is by Fats Waller. Has anyone heard of Fats Waller here? I know you have. We're old farts, so we know Fats Waller. I'm the oldest one of all. And so I began thinking of musical introduction. So I'll sing the last part of a song written by a man that nobody knows named Andy Ratzap. Andy Ratzap was an African-American lyricist who came from Washington, D.C. and in 1929, I was going to be a historian, wrote the lyrics for Fats Waller's famous song, Black and Blue. Does anyone know Black and Blue? If you have, can get a hold of a copy of a recording or go see Ain't Misbehavin', it's in Ain't Misbehavin'. It's a terribly sad moment in that film. Has anyone ever seen Ain't Misbehavin'? Okay. Does anyone know? Some of you know Black and Blue. I'm sing it anyway. And I'm doing this to revive interest in Andy Ratzap, who's an amazing lyricist, but when you're a lyricist and you're African American, it's just So I'll sing to you, and then I'm going to make 5 points about the movie. And then I will turn to Alan and to Haider, who will make some comments. And then, quite frankly, I just want to open it up for general discussion because people's reaction to this are very, very different. Some of my colleagues won't go to see it because they're afraid of violence. Well, I'm not afraid of violence. So I went to see it, and it just bothered me at all. So may I sing? Okay. The last lines of Black and Blue. How will it end? Ain't got a friend. My only sin is in my skin. What did I do to be so black and blue? Marvelous, right? In a few lines summing up the African-American experience, and you could almost inject it into Django Unchained. You want to look up the lyrics sometime and read them, you know, because they are a side of American life that I think many people who are not people of color don't get, you know, and this is something important. I read about 500 reviews of Django Unchained, and I picked out my favorite line from Joel Ellenstein's New York Magazine review. He called it "Mana for Mayhem Mavens," which I thought was nice. Mana for Mayhem. So I'm going to make 5 points, and I'll try to make them each in about 2 minutes, so that you can have something to chew on about what I was extracting from the movie as a historian. Okay, and that's what I want to do. First of all, this movie is really, really interesting with regard to democracy and human rights. So I'm trying to fit it into the school in some way, and particularly under federalism, which is often praised in this country, but in certain aspects of race relations has been an absolute catastrophe. And so, oh, there you are, Alan, you're leaving already. I'm sending you the most oppressive units of government, and you see this done so beautifully by Quentin Tarantino, is not the federal government. It is, in effect, the decentralized state and the decentralized plantation, suggesting that you can get horrific oppression without a strong federal government, a centralized government. And thus, when you get federalization, you sometimes get some of the worst oppression in history. This is true for those of you who've been in my courses of what happened during witchcraft persecution, right? And so the idea of oppression comes from many sources, not just from a government on top. And the absolute wonderful way he does that plantation with Fake Candyland is a perfect example of decentralization. That's point one that I want to make, and I'll open this up to discussion about what we do in our country. And Calvin Candy is Caligula in a decentralized system of government. You know, Caligula from ancient Rome, and behaves just about the same way. Point two. One of the scenes in this movie, which is absolutely fascinating to me, was when they're trying to decide what to do with Django. He's strung up. I'll get to the other side of it. And they decide finally to send him to a mine. This is an amazing insight into what is going to happen after slavery has ended. He has value as a slave. They're not going to castrate him. They're not going to kill him. They're going to send him to a mine, which, because Al and I read the same book on this, is very, very important in terms of using the criminal justice system after slavery to make sure that slavery continued, in the words of one writer, by another name. And it's just wonderful, because what is happening here would be very rare at that time. Normally, slaves are not sent to mines because it's an agricultural economy and it's king cotton. But afterwards, as it self-industrializes, they still abuse African Americans in precisely the same way, but now they use the criminal justice system, which you see, by the way, right on up to the 1960s, suggesting that slavery continued, which I think is a very good point. You see this in the book Slavery by Another Name, and also a wonderful musical from the Scottsboro Boys called the Scottsboro Boys, which was done by Kander and Ebb, which you probably never seen, but I did see it in Minneapolis. So there's 2 points, from plantation to mine, and Tarantino's got it right. He's looking into the future about what's going to happen. Point 3, the fighting scenes. Long ago, I used to teach a course here on sports and international politics. It was discontinued, but not by me. So, I cast aspersions on other people. They kill me for doing this. But there are fighting scenes in here which are extraordinary. Do you remember that? Who's seen the movie? Have you seen some of you have? Those are amazing things that are going on. And I found myself asking, is that true and is it correct? First of all, interplantation fighting and fighting on plantations with people betting was a commonplace, right? One of the most famous boxers, I must have been a student of boxing, in the 19th century was a man named Tom Melano, who won his freedom through boxing on a plantation in 1809 and went on to become one of the most famous fighters in English history. So there was a good side to it. You don't see the good side in this movie at all. And here again, as a historian, I was asking myself, was this common, in particular, fighting to the death? The answer is not really, simply because you have value attached to the African-American body, right, to the slave body, and therefore this would be a unique event. Probably only people of enormous wealth, like Calvin Candy, could afford something like that. But afterwards, what happens? The boxing continues after the Civil War. Blacks can only fight blacks. They are put into rings in something called the Battle Royal, a phrase you probably know the origin of packing 6 or 7 African-American fighters into a ring, blindfolding them, and the last man who was standing wins $2, right? This is the origins, by the way, of the most famous black fighter of the turn of the century, and I'm talking about not this one, but the one before that one, and that is the life of Jack Johnson, who began his career in Galveston, Texas, as part of Battle Royals. Since he was so good, he usually won. but it meant everybody else had to be floored, and then you took off the blindfold. And this was entertainment for whites who bet on them. In other words, the same kind of process continues even after slavery is gone. It took a long time into the 1890s before you had a black champion. His name, if you're interested, was George Dixon. And he won in the featherweight division because no one was allowed to fight for the heavyweight championship unless they were white. And all of the fighters who we revere were ferocious racists, including John L. Sullivan, right, gentleman Jim Corbett, who was not a gentleman when it came to issues like that, and so many others, right? And so when Jack Johnson finally wins the heavyweight crown in he won it by fighting Tommy Burns 2 years earlier, but the Great White Hope fight of 1910 is historic because finally we had a black heavyweight champion, and Jack Dempsey, when he wins the crown, refuses to fight any black fighters, and so you have a gap of 22 years. I mean, the racial aspects of boxing fighting are really extraordinary, and it's a wonderful, wonderful topic to study, and it fits in nicely. By the way, you should take a look at the wonderful Ken Burns documentary, Unforgivable Blackness, which is one of, in my view, the finest thing that Ken Burns ever did, for those of you who know. The castration scene. You know I was getting things like that. You all remember the scene, which is very dramatic, where he's hanging upside down and he's about to be castrated, but they don't castrate him. Okay? And this is very interesting in terms of the black experience in America. He's not castrated simply because he still has values. And so they send him off to die in a mine, they'll put a number on him. It's a concentration camp system on that. And that in itself would be very rare. But castration reaches its heyday after slavery, when slaves no longer have any monetary value attached to them. And so it is tied to lynching. Thus, castration is a product of lynching, not slavery. I'm trying to give you some sense of progress here. And Tarantino has a feeling for this. He's quite remarkable in terms of how he sensed that they're not going to castrate him. But believe you me, if it had been after the Civil War, he would have been castrated and hung on a tree. And the words of another song turned into a song sung by Billie Holiday called Strange Fruit. Have you ever heard of Strange Fruit? I mean, that's extraordinary on that. And so, again, I'm trying to put this into historicize this one. But there is lashing, which takes place in many societies when you don't want to damage people. It's a tradition in the British Navy, and it's a tradition on plantations, right? Where you can hurt people and make them suffer, but not destroy their labor value. So if anyone is interested in the subject of how labor is punished, you get a very, very good sense of it in this film. And then finally, a thought, and I've run on too long, but I'm very fascinated by this film, black on black violence. I'm going to say something which will be very controversial, which has to do with one of the characters played brilliantly by Samuel L. Jackson in the movie Stephen, right? And in the end, when he gets blown up, and he's supposed to cheer. But there really is nothing to cheer about here. Let me just say, because nobody's noticed this shit about the Stephen character in that film. Well, it is a story which is remarkable. He's 76 years old. He's born into a world that he never made. And like most people, right? Django is an exception. Like most people, he is really good to adjusting to systems of injustice and working his way up to the top, right? He's an ass kisser, you know? But so most people are. My God, you find that in business, you find it in government, and dare I say, even in academia. You want a list? Now. This is what I get from talking to you before. I'm Western now. Okay? It's the parable here for those of you in international affairs is the security dilemma. What do you do when someone is mean to you? Right? You can confront them. By the way, anyone interested in women's rights knows about this, because women often find themselves in oppressive situations. And you got two choices, right? You can fight back and turn into Django, but that's not what most people do. Please, I understand this actually work in a safe house. Usually, you figure out a way to gain as much power as you can within the system. And so my view of Stephen, I find, is not so much hateful, right, as understanding that in systems of power and corruption, people, in effect, do their best. I try to think of a phrase for it. He's not an eminence grise, that's the French for Richelieu and Mazarin in the 17th century. He's kind of an eminence noire. You understand what I'm doing here? Black a black man has figured out how to work the system and to become something of a confidential advisor to Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie Mr. Candy. And those are choices that you always have. And so in some ways you could say, well, of course he's going to be blown up in the end, so constantly pandering to Calvin Candy, but that's what people do all the time, you know. And so I find myself not hating him, but understanding that if you're caught in a system that you did not make, you do your best, and very few people will stand up like Django to do that. So there are 5 points. I'll turn it over to Alan. I went on too long, forgive me, but God damn it, I organized this thing.